Thank you, Mr. President. I want to speak for a few minutes about the EPA rules on water. The EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, is in Missouri today to discuss the EPA's proposed rule, which would significantly expand the authority of the United States under the Clean Water Act. In a conference call with reporters yesterday, Administrator McCarthy calls some of the questions about the rule silly and ludicrous, and said that her trip to Missouri is part of a broader campaign to reassure the agricultural community and set the record straight. I hope she's spending at least as much time in my state listening as she is talking. And if she does that, I think she'll find out that some of these concerns are not only very real, but they have lots of impact, and not just for the farm community across the country, but for lots of people who are affected in lots of different ways by what happens if you expand the authority of the federal government, as this rule would, to deal with water almost everywhere and almost all water. You know, not only did she say that these questions were silly and ludicrous, but when the Missouri Farm Bureau expressed the concern that they said virtually every acre of private property potentially falls under the Clean Water Act jurisdiction, things that you normally do on a farm would be called into question. According to the Springfield News Leader, Administrator McCarthy said that was, these are quotes from the paper, McCarthy says that's hogwash. Now, if the way to actually deal with the people we work for is to say your ideas are silly, they're ludicrous, your comments are hogwash, I think once again we are certainly seeing the federal government at its worst, not at its best. This is a big organization. It is a well-run organization. It's represented Missouri agricultural interest for a long time. And when their spokesman stands up and says virtually every acre of private property potentially falls under the Clean Water Act jurisdiction if this rule is finalized, at least 40 members of this body, I'm convinced, believe that to be the case. That's what they said, and she said it's hogwash. And then, according to the paper, she rattled off what she said were some of the most dubious claims made by the rule's critics. Now, this is a rule that has critics because it's a rule that deserves to have critics. It draws concerns from farmers. And in fact, just today, I said, before I come over, let's be sure I know that we haven't had an epiphany of understanding here. And suddenly, Administrator McCarthy said, I've listened and you're right. These are problems we need to find the answers to. But what I found when I looked was that the farmers she met with today, there was no press in the meeting that included the farmers, and there were no farmers in the meeting that included the press. So the farm families were concerned. You take the press out, away from everybody else. You go out on this farm and talk about, I assume, all the great benefits that more federal control of that farmland would produce. But then when you have the meeting with the farmers, no press in that meeting where anybody can hear the concerns that these farmers have. I think, again, the members of the Senate have been pretty clear as we co-sponsored bills that would require the EPA to withdraw this rule and try again. It's clear that this is really a blatant overreach into the private lives, private property rights of the American people by the administration, and not just farmers, anybody that owns land anywhere. If I was just hearing from farmers, I'd be concerned, but I'm hearing from farmers, I'm hearing from builders, I'm hearing from realtors, I'm hearing from local governments. What happens if the federal government has this most broad definition of waters of the United States? The proposed rule will give EPA, the Corps of Engineers, the most extreme of environmental groups, a powerful tool to delay almost anything, to prevent development, to prevent land use on property owned by municipalities, property owned by individuals, property owned by farming families, by small businesses, because all that property, Mr. President, includes water in some way or another. And the law was pretty clear when it was written that the EPA, under the Clean Water Act, would have authority over the navigable waters of the United States. This rule in fact, makes the assertion and the jurisdictional assertion that really navigable waters now means any water that could go into navigable waters. Any water that could eventually flow into the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and all water everywhere. Eventually, some of it heads to those places. So every drop of water everywhere is potentially under the jurisdiction of the EPA. Navigable waters means what it means. There was an editorial today in the Washington Post which actually supported the rule, but I thought the most interesting sentence in that editorial today that supports the rule was right in almost the exact middle of the editorial. It said, "It's true that the agency's plan would expand the scope of the Clean Water Act regulation." Now, the way it expands the scope of the Clean Water Act regulation is it expands the scope of the Clean Water Act. We actually have a procedure for that. It's the procedure that everybody who took a civics class learned when they took that civics class. The House passes a bill or the Senate passes a bill. The two come together. I know this doesn't happen as often as it needs to anymore, but that's not an excuse that that's not the way it has to happen. The two come together, they agree on a bill, goes back to both houses, they vote on that bill one final time, it goes to the president's desk and gets signed into law. That's how you expand the Clean Water Act. You don't expand the Clean Water Act by somebody saying, you know, we just really think that the Congress should have done something here that they didn't do, and so we're going to do it. And then your friends who actually support the goal are so lulled into the idea that the government won't work that they even forget the constitutional process and said, well, there's no question. The truth is this expands the regulations under the Clean Water Act. If you ask anybody at the Washington Post or anybody else that uses words all the time, define navigable waters of the United States. Nobody would say that's any water that flows into any water that might eventually flow into water that you can navigate. Nobody would say that. Nobody would say that's the navigable waters of the United States. But that's the authority that the EPA has. Now we're talking about the authority the EPA would like to take. And that's why a number of my colleagues, I think 30 of us joined Senator Barrasso, 29 of us joined Senator Barrasso in a bill that would just say you can't do this. We're going to protect the water and property rights and stop the EPA from going beyond the law. Senator Barrasso is also going to file that as an amendment that I intend to support on the bill before us now, the Sportsman's Act, that has lots of water implications, many of which I've supported. The Wetlands Act, there are many things in there that I can be supportive of, but I'm not supportive without any congressional authority of the EPA deciding they're just going to take property rights from people who have those rights. I'm particularly not supportive of that when the law was designed to define what the EPA could do. And if anybody wants to go out and do any kind of survey of the American people, let alone the legislators who voted for the Clean Water Act, and ask them what navigable waters is, nobody thinks that that's every drop of water that eventually flows to a source that could at some point in the distant distance be navigable. We know what the law says. We know the authority the EPA has been given. I think we could have a legitimate debate about whether that authority's been properly used or not, but there is no legitimate debate about whether the EPA is trying to go way beyond what the Congress has authorized. This idea that the administration has that the pen and the phone will replace the Constitution of the United States is not worthy of this country. It's not worthy of what we do. It is a disastrous course to set to believe, okay, Congress, you deal with immigration in the next 60 days, or I'll just do it on my own. Congress, you change the Clean Water Act, or we'll just change the Clean Water Act with regulation. Congress, you change the Clean Air Act, or we'll change the Clean Air Act. There is a reason for the constitutional process. And I hope Missourians in the next 24 hours are given a chance to remind Administrator McCarthy of what that reason is. And there are reasons that the Congress is looking for ways to remind the President of what that is. That's why I'm supporting the Enforce the Law Act that's already passed the House of Representatives. And what the Enforce the Law Act would do would just give individual members of Congress standing if a majority of either house of the Congress believed the President wasn't enforcing the law as written, to go to a court and ask the court to decide, is the President enforcing the law as written or not? In my view, there is no way in the world that you can look at this proposed rule by the EPA and believe that the EPA and this administration is in any way complying with what is the clear intent of the law. If they don't like the law, there's a way to come to the Congress and ask to change the law, and that is their job. It is not their job to do the job of the Congress, the job the Constitution left to somebody besides the executive, whose job is to execute the law, not to improve on the law, not to write the law, not to make the law. And we see all those things being attempted by people who believe they know what's better for the United States of America than the people of the United States believe is good for the United States of America. And I would yield the floor.